Hi everybody, joining me today is Mr. Samuel Andreyev. He is a Canadian composer and writer residing in France, and he also has a YouTube channel with the same name. Hi Mr. Andreyev, welcome to the channel. How are you doing?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to talk to you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So to begin with, could you please tell, for people who don't know, what type of work you do in terms of music, and also what subjects you usually explore in your YouTube channel?
Okay, so my main training is as a composer, and that's most of what I do. So in other words, there are orchestras and ensembles and soloists and chamber groups that commission me to write pieces for them. So that's the main part of my work. So an orchestra, for example, might say, we want a piece, and I'll write them something. And so that's the biggest part of my work. And then I also am very involved as an educator as well. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is providing information on music, basically for the general public, in a way that is accessible, but also that doesn't simplify things too much, let's put it that way, because sometimes if you make something overly accessible, it can be difficult to treat the subject properly. So I think that the challenging thing that I've been trying to do with my own channel is to take very complex ideas and express them in such a way that they are very accessible. So that's something I've been very preoccupied with for the past year and a half through the channel. So on my YouTube channel, I mainly look at works of 20th century music. So sometimes I go a little bit farther back. I do have a video on Bach, for example, and all of the videos I do are historically informed. So they're not only about the work of a given 20th century composer, but I usually try to connect it to the music of the past as well, because Western music is a very old tradition, and the great works of the 20th century are written within that tradition. So I always try to make that clear in my videos. But generally speaking, the repertoire that interests me the most is mainly 20th century repertoire. A lot of it is post-war music, actually. And that's a repertoire that, for various reasons, has been, I think, more difficult for the public to understand and appreciate, or at least it's maybe not as familiar. So what I'm trying to do is to sort of decomplexify that repertoire and just show people exactly what's going on in these pieces, and just sort of give general audiences an idea of how they might be able to approach them.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, now to get into a more specific subject, what are the main differences because I mean many people associate what we tend to call classical music with the compositions that were written and composed, let's say, until the early 20th century, I would say, and to people like Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, and so on. What are the main differences between these types of more classical compositions and modern music, but at this stage still of the same style?
Right. Okay. So, in order to answer that question, we have to look at music history in slightly more detail. So, you could say that the body of Western music that we have that exists in some kind of written down form. In other words, pieces that we can perform more or less accurately because it's written down and because we know essentially how it's meant to be played, dates back about 600 years or so, 600, maybe 700 years. If you go earlier than that, you start dealing with things that are a lot harder to decipher, and the notation is a lot less precise. Also, there are a lot of innovations in terms of how complex you could make a piece of written music around the 14th century particularly. So anyways, we've got about 600 or 700 years of repertoire. So within that very long span of time, there are a lot of different styles that have been practiced and a lot of different approaches. And so it isn't as though it were just a homogeneous continuum from 1300 onwards up to today. So there were a lot of what you might call what's the best word? I suppose you could say that there's a kind of alternation between two different types of historical period in music history. There are periods of rapid expansion on the one hand, where composers are preoccupied with pushing the boundaries, testing the limits, trying new techniques, taking new innovations and pushing them as far as they will go. And then those sorts of periods tend to be followed by periods of consolidation, where, on the contrary, you try to simplify, you try to make things clearer, you eliminate things that aren't absolutely necessary, you focus on a small number of elements, and so on. So throughout musical history, you have this sort of constant alternation between those two states. So that's a slightly simplified way of explaining it, but I think on the whole, I think that's more or less a valid way of looking at it. So what happens in the 20th century is very interesting, and so in order to explain it, you have to go a little bit farther back. It actually starts with the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, where suddenly the number of people who have leisure time available to them, in other words, people who are able to spend time at home playing an instrument or listening to music or going to concerts or whatever it is, suddenly explodes. So up to that point, you actually had a relatively small fraction of, for example, the European public who would be actually able to go and hear a piece, because most of the time either they wouldn't have the money, or they wouldn't have access to concerts, or they wouldn't have the spare time, or whatever it might have been. But with the Industrial Revolution, you start getting a much larger middle class, and these middle class people have more time. So that sort of resulted in an explosion of interest in so-called art music. Mm-hmm. And what happens in the 20th century is that you get all of these composers who suddenly have the ability to make recordings of their pieces, to have them published, to have them circulate much more quickly and much more widely than was the case previously. And also that sort of coincides with the sort of romantic idea of the individual artist, the artist who's not simply going to give the audience what they already expect and what they already know about, but the artist who's going to express their own subjective self and who's going to develop a personal style. And so all of these things sort of start to come together in the late 19th century. So you start getting composers who are writing in very individual styles, they're innovating a great deal, they're writing music that comes out of maybe a local, national tradition of some kind, but sort of developing a style that's quite individual, generally speaking. And that process of individualization of musical styles just gets faster and faster in the 20th century. And so, and also the rate at which the styles progress and evolve and change also gets a lot faster. So up to about the mid-19th century, the language of music actually evolved relatively slowly in terms of its basic building blocks. But in the 20th century, and particularly in the post-war period, you start getting just an extraordinarily rapid explosion. And that's due to all sorts of reasons. So the Industrial Revolution just had an incalculable impact on music making. It also improved the process of manufacturing woodwind instruments, so all the instruments of the orchestra. So, and it also resulted in a great deal of innovation in terms of the design and the invention and the fabrication of instruments, generally speaking. So the orchestras became much larger, the sort of range of sounds that were available to composers became much more varied and much richer. And so all of this just had a gigantic effect on music, generally speaking. And so where that leaves us today really is that I think the difficulty maybe that some people have in coming to terms with more recent music is that there's just been this incredible explosion of styles. So it isn't comparable to the situation that might have been the case in, say, the late 18th century, where there would have been a relatively small number of styles being practiced. There were certain fixed genres like the symphony, the concerto, the opera, and so on, where you would basically know what to expect. There wouldn't be any gigantic surprises if you went to hear a symphony. Whereas today, you have no idea what you're going to hear, because there are hundreds, thousands of individual styles being practiced. They're different from one country to the next. They're different from one composer to the next. So the audience who's trying to approach music since, let's say, 1945 is confronted with this crazy array of different styles. And so it's sort of difficult, I think, if you approach that for the first time, to get oriented because, well, simply because you're not actually altogether sure what you're hearing maybe for the first time.
Mm-hmm, exactly. But in terms of the music which was composed, let's say, until the 19th century, when people had less instruments available, let's say, and the styles of music were more limited, when we are talking about the same style of music, but that is composed today, are there big differences between what was composed then in terms of that style of music and what is composed now?
Well, I don't think you can say that the same style is really being used today. I think you can say that there's a continuation, there's a tradition of a sort. So, in other words, the language of music evolves over time. It's not a static thing. It isn't as though the rules of music were set down in the 17th century and they haven't changed since. It's not really like that. So composers throughout history have innovated and they've tried to find new approaches, and sometimes they innovate within the tradition. In other words, they take what already exists and they just add something. They invent something, or they try a slightly different approach. And in that case, sort of the evolution of the language of music can happen relatively slowly. In some cases, they bring in outside influences and other things. In other words, things that actually have nothing to do per se with the development of Western music, and they integrate it into their technique. So you can't really say that the styles being practiced today are the same, because the styles always evolve throughout history. So the style of 16th century music is very different from the style of 14th century music. But you can speak of a tradition. You can say that there's a continuity, there's a continuum upon which various composers throughout history are situated. So as far as the differences between what's being written now and what was being written in the past, it's difficult to speak in general terms about that, because it's always better to talk about specific pieces, because again, the music of the 20th century and the 21st century is so diverse and so various and so complicated and complex. I mean, you can't speak generally about it. You really do have to speak about individual pieces. But one thing I think you can say is that, for example, the music of the classical period, so the period between the Baroque and the Romantic period, for example, so that's basically early 18th century music for the most part. That particular repertoire, so this would be well, let's put it a little bit later. Let's say more like the end of the 18th century. That would be sort of Mozart, Haydn, early Beethoven, things like that. Those are composers who are preoccupied with the sort of clarity of their formal outlines. There's usually a clear division between the melodic aspect of the piece and everything else that's going on within it. There's always some kind of a theme or a melody that you can pick out that's clear. There's a kind of idea of symmetrical structures as well. And all of that sort of starts to go out the window to some degree with Romanticism, where you have structures that are a lot more complicated. The language of music, harmonically especially, the chords that composers are using start to get more and more unusual and less predictable. So I think one thing you could say is that the language of music gradually became less predictable over time. That's probably the best way to describe it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and because since the Industrial Revolution, more and more people have been having access to music. People nowadays, there are many people nowadays that criticize the industry of music because what they tend to classify as under the banner of pop music, they say that they are less rich music compositions. Do you agree with this assessment of it, or do you think that it's simply a different variety of styles that people nowadays have access to?
Well, there's lots of different parallel traditions within music history. So a lot of what we call Western music has essentially a religious or a liturgical function, if you look back in history. So the earliest notated Western music that we have is almost always some form of a religious, has some form of a religious text as its basis. But you also have popular traditions. You have music that's meant to be played in the streets, it's meant to be played in pubs and so on, or by fiddlers or whatever it is. And so and then there's the music, there's folk music, actual folk music. In other words, music that is played by sort of ordinary people in the place that they live, and these are sort of local traditions. And they're not necessarily musics that are primarily written down. So they're transmitted from generation to generation through directly playing and directly showing younger people how you go about playing it, but it's not primarily written down. So you have to make a distinction between music that is primarily written down, in other words, there's a score, there's some kind of a notation, and music that is just played, like the way you might pick up a guitar and play a pop song, for example. You can transcribe it, you can make a score of it, but that's not its primary That's not the primary way that the music is transmitted. So today it's the same thing. I mean, you have what you might call an art music tradition. I don't like that term at all because all music is art. But I suppose you could say you have a tradition of music that is primarily written down and is primarily meant to be performed in a concert setting. And then on the other hand, you have pieces of popular music, and that can take all sorts of different forms. Obviously, there's thousands of genres and subgenres within the popular traditions, and I don't really see one as being better than the other. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think that the functions that they have are completely different. So, a piece of, let's say, art music, for example, like a piece of written music that is meant to be performed and that can enter into some kind of a repertory, is very often a piece that is designed to be listened to multiple times. In other words, you could hear it 10 times, 20 times, 30 times and always find something new in it. I think that's the hallmark of a great piece, by the way, is that you can, not only can an individual listener return to it multiple times, but the piece will have something to say to successive generations as well. So, for example, I find it absolutely incredible that it's possible for me to sit down and listen to, for example, a 15th century Franco-Flemish mass, and that will speak to me, it'll communicate to me. It won't have used up its expressive potential, and then me as an individual, I can listen to that piece 500 times and always find something new in it and enjoy it each time. Whereas I think that a lot of popular traditions are a little bit different in that respect. So there are obviously pop songs that you can listen to many, many, many times and still get a lot out of it. But I think a lot of them are written more spontaneously. They're meant to be more directly communicative. They're not so much objects of contemplation exactly. They're more something that has an explicitly social dimension to it. Maybe more than is the case with a lot of so-called art music, where very often it's a more intimate experience. It's not so much about communicating with millions of people simultaneously, as it can be the case with a piece of pop music these days. But it's a more direct form of communication between the performer and the audience, or at least I think it should be that way. And it's something that you can return to quite a lot of times and hear different facets of it each time.
Mm-hmm. So we have these differences in terms of function, and as you say, throughout history we always had the music, let's say, that was played and composed for the elites, and the music that was much more for people in general, for people. So do you think that in terms of composition and in terms of richness of the way the music is composed, that we can tell that there are some differences between those two types of music, and not just in terms of social function?
Oh, certainly. I mean, there's a difference in terms of complexity. So if you were to compare a Beatles song to a Beethoven symphony, it's not the same degree of complexity. Now, I'm not saying that complexity in and of itself is a supreme value. I'm not saying that something is better than something else because it's more complex. But when something is more complex, then it's more complex. There's more that you can do with it. It might be more subtle. It might have more going on in it. It might have more to say on successive hearings and so on. But again, you don't want all pieces of music to have the same function. Like, you don't always want to have to sit down and listen to a half-hour-long piece of music with great concentration. Sometimes you just want something to relax to. You want something that's fun. You want something that you can listen to with your friends. You want something to listen to in the car while you're doing dishes, whatever. I mean, one of the amazing things about music is that it just has an insane number of functions. So it can accompany any aspect of your life, really. And so, I would say that the best art music is something that can ideally encourage listeners to enter into a state of really profound contemplation and connect with things that are extremely powerful. I think that's the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so now, putting aside the differences between the many types of music we have, what would you say are the universal traits of music across cultures and times? Because it seems to me that, at least, for example, the fact that music has to have a certain rhythm and it has to be harmonic, and it has to be repetitive in some way or another. The same music composition has to have some sort of repetition on it for people to like it. Would you agree with these, and perhaps could you tell us other traits you think are essential to music and for people across cultures and times to appreciate music?
I think that in most cases some form of a pattern is important, for sure. But if you were to, the problem with this sort of definition though is that it's always possible to find an exception. It's always possible to find a piece, for example, that contains little or no repetition and that is still a valid piece of music. So I think that if you really wanted to boil it down to the absolute basis of what is music, I think the most you can really say is that the material of music is sound, and the dimension that it exists in is time, and it exists in the domain of culture as opposed to the domain of nature. That's what I would say about it. As far as the rest goes, well, you mentioned harmony, but there's lots of music that doesn't have harmony. And for example, if you look at sub-Saharan African percussion music, there's no harmony in it, but it's extremely complex as far as rhythm goes. If you look at Southern Indian music, that's another example, then very often there's no harmony either. You have a drone, and on top of the drone you have extraordinarily complex melodic conventions, but you don't really have harmony. So different cultures have developed different aspects of the musical phenomenon to different degrees. In the West, I think that one thing you can say about Western classical music is that it's not particularly complex as far as rhythm goes. In fact, a lot of it boils down to a relatively small number of basically dance rhythms. So most of the classical and romantic repertoire, you know, the number of basic rhythmic figures that repertoire uses is actually quite limited. And if you were to compare that to the music of Bali, for example, or the music of certain Southern African cultures, I mean, you'd find that it's nowhere near as complicated. But what Western music has developed, I think, to maybe a singular degree, is the concept of polyphony, where you have multiple different strands going on simultaneously, and they're coherent on two planes at once. They're coherent in terms of the individual line that each instrument or group of instruments or voice is playing, and they're also coherent in terms of the way they superimpose and create harmony together. So I don't think you can have a music that's extremely complex on all levels all the time. So I think that sort of partly explains why in Western music you have this tendency over history towards ever greater sophistication of the polyphonic aspect in terms of how many different sounds we can take in simultaneously and how complex their relationships can be and so on. And relative simplicity as far as rhythm and melody go. So it really depends on the culture. So yeah, you can certainly think of music that isn't explicitly pattern-based, or that has no harmony, or even that doesn't have any particular rhythmic dimension. For example, I've heard ritual Tibetan music, for example, and I wouldn't call it particularly rhythmic. So I mean, there's lots of examples of things like that. They're still music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you talked about a pattern. When you talk about a pattern, are you talking about some sort of repetition that goes along inside the same music composition? So, for example, you just talked about ritual music. Doesn't it involve a kind of repetition?
Well, repetition is in music is important because you need to have the ability to have musical objects be recognizable and to propagate themselves through time. So in other words, if you hear an event in a piece of music and it happens only once, and maybe it lasts for 3 seconds, and then that's it, and then you're on to something else, then your piece is going to have basically no memory whatsoever, and there's going to be no particular reason why event A should follow some other event, or it would be very difficult for the listener to enter into a proper frame of listening, because each new event would essentially replace the previous one without there being any continuity in the piece. So you have to have some kind of a notion of continuity or permanence, at least, of the musical objects. So that can take the form of repetition, but it can also take the form of what's known as development, where, in other words, you take a simple idea. It could be a theme, it could be a rhythmic idea, it could be a texture, it could be a a certain number of voices singing together in a certain way, and that idea or that object or whatever it is projected through time, and there's some sort of a process that's applied to it. In other words, it gets gradually higher, it gets gradually lower, it gets softer and softer, it gets louder and louder. There's some kind of a directional tendency in it that allows you to get from point A to point B. It's like it has an arrow on it, and it's pointing in a certain direction, and that sort of carries you along, because the idea, whatever it is, it's not that it's repeating exactly, it's that it's changing over time in a consistent manner, so that you're able to follow the continuity between point A and point B. So it's not quite the same thing as repetition.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that it, for example, starts from a focal point and then expands little by little. And so, for example, we could start with a single person singing, and then we join together other people to join the music composition. Is that what you're trying to expose here?
That could be an idea, yeah. And so if you were to compare two different individual moments in that process, let's say that process lasts for 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. So at the beginning you have one voice, and then you have two, and then three, and so on, and then at the end you have a full choir that's singing. So if you compare any two moments of that process, none of them are identical. So you can't really say, oh, it's repeating exactly. But you can say that there's a continuity in it, and it's leading you from point A to point B across time.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that music at least has to have some sort of transformation with time, or not? Inside the same music composition, not exactly the same throughout the entire music composition, but some sort of transformation?
I would say that in most cases that's true, yeah, but not every case. I mean, there are also examples of types of music that are completely non-directional. So improvised music is an example of that, or jazz, certain types of jazz, certain types of Indian music as well are like that, where there's not a particular sense of direction. There might be a piece that lasts for 4 or 5 hours, and what's going on is that you might have a singer and they're telling a story, a very long epic story, and the music itself has no particular sort of evolutionary drive in it in particular. It's not really leading in a specific direction. It just sort of is circling around the same basic ideas for a certain amount of time. So again, it's difficult to talk about these things without pointing to specific works. It's hard to talk about it in general terms, but yeah, I would say that in most cases, though, there's some kind of a directional tendency. There's some kind of a, well, let's say that there's an opposition between two conflicting forces of some kind. I'd say that that's a relatively permanent feature of Western music composition. That's a dialectical idea. The idea that you have idea A and you have idea B, and they're somehow contrasted with each other, they're different from each other, and you have some kind of a resolution that happens over time. So that's an idea that's quite prominent in the history of Western music, and that particularly becomes important in the classical and Romantic periods.
Mm-hmm. And one very interesting question I have for you is if there's some examples of composers nowadays, or ancient composers, more ancient composers that were born deaf, because we have examples of composers who weren't born deaf, but then throughout their lifetime they became deaf and still were able to compose music. Are there any kind of examples of composers that were born deaf and even so were able to compose music?
I can't think of any offhand, but there probably are actually some deaf composers. I wouldn't be surprised, because it's amazing what people can do. There is actually a deaf percussion player called Evelyn Glennie, and that's absolutely, I mean, she's a virtuoso percussionist and she's deaf. And I don't really understand exactly how she does it, but it has something to do with being able to feel the vibrations and having really developed that sense to an unbelievable degree. But as far as composers who are deaf from birth, I can't really think of any options. I can't think of any examples off the cuff like that. But certainly Beethoven is a famous example of a composer who became profoundly deaf in his later life, and that's also a very interesting phenomenon, because you can see Beethoven's music evolving over time in parallel with his deafness, and it certainly did change his music. There's no question about that. So I don't think that a deaf composer would have the same approach to writing music as somebody who can hear. I mean, I guess that's an obvious point, but no, I can't think of any examples offhand of someone who was born deaf and became a composer.
Mhm. And about the particular story of Beethoven, do you know any particularities about how he managed to compose music after he became deaf? Was it through vibration or something else?
Well, to answer that question, I have to first explain that composers typically do a lot of ear training, and they typically develop their inner ear to a great degree. So, in other words, a lot of composers don't actually work at an instrument. They don't need a piano or a violin or whatever it is in order to be able to write their music. And that's my case. I work at a desk. I write my music at a desk, and that's the case of a lot of my colleagues as well. So part of the training is that you spend a great deal of time learning how to read scores. So in other words, you can pick up a piece of written music and hear it by reading it. You can hear it in your head. And so that's just a skill that is part of the professional training of composers. So someone like Beethoven, by the time he was starting to go deaf, I mean, he already had tens of thousands of hours of experience doing that. So I don't think that, I mean, obviously it's not an optimal situation not to be able to hear what you're writing and not to be able to try it out on a keyboard or whatever it is, but it also didn't prevent him from writing, because the language of music has a grammar and a syntax to it, especially the language of the early 19th century, at the time when Beethoven was writing and was starting to experience his profound deafness. And you can actually imagine musical structures and musical architectures without actually even thinking specifically about the sound dimension. So you learn counterpoint, you learn harmony, you learn how to write down rhythms and so on, and you can approach that sort of thing as a form of a purely written art without actually having to hear it be played, and still know what it is and know what it is that you're doing and what it's going to sound like and so on and so forth. So,
and when you're writing a piece of music at your desk, how does it work? When you're writing, do you have in your head how the music would sound, or not?
It's very precise. Yeah, I hear everything. I hear the notes, certainly the pitches, the intervals. I hear the dynamics, how loud it is, how soft it is. I hear the rhythms. I hear the sound qualities of each individual instrument of the orchestra or of the ensemble that I'm writing for. So, for example, if I'm writing for a flute, mm-hmm. It makes a big difference if the flute is playing in its low register or if it's playing in its high register or medium. In terms of how loud it can play, how soft it can play, how quickly you can repeat notes, how quickly you can change from one register to another, and all of these sorts of things. So I have a very detailed knowledge of the technical capabilities of all the instruments of the orchestra, and so when I'm writing, I have a very detailed sound image in my head of exactly what it is that I'm writing and what it's going to sound like. So when I arrive in a rehearsal situation, by that point, I've already rehearsed the piece in my head many times, so I know exactly what it is that I want to hear, generally speaking. So occasionally there might be a surprise, there might be maybe a dynamic marking, like maybe something needs to be a little bit softer or a little bit louder, or maybe that instrument should come out a bit more, that sort of thing. But generally speaking, it corresponds to what I imagine in my head. So, but that's part of the training. So a lot of people who aren't musicians find that, I think, abstract, or they have trouble imagining how someone can do that. But really, I mean, every professional musician, well, particularly composers, have to do that. I mean, you have to learn how to do it, because I don't see how you could write music otherwise. You have to be able to imagine it precisely, so you know exactly what it is that you want. Like, first you have to formulate an idea. You have to have something to say. You have to have an expressive aim of some kind. And then secondly, you have to actually have the technique to be able to write it down and to be able to communicate to other people how it is that you want it to be played. But all of that, again, is just part of the training.
Mm-hmm. And one last question, and just to go back to what we were talking about earlier. Since the Industrial Revolution, so we had this kind of revolution also in the terms of how music is produced and how music reaches a bigger number of people. And so would you say that the music industry had some sort of deliberate influence on how certain types of music became popular, or that it just picked up on the preferences coming from the consumers in that particular culture, or even some innate preferences people have, and then expanded on that?
Well, that's an interesting question, actually, and that's something I've been thinking about quite a lot in relation to pop music, particularly of the mid to late '60s, which I think is a very interesting period, because, and I've talked about this actually with some musicians who were active in that period, because if you look at music up to about, let's say, 1964, 1965, a lot of it is relatively conventional, relatively repetitive, and just not very innovative, not particularly interesting. In other words, it's doing what other people have done thousands of times already, and maybe doing it slightly differently, but that's about it. And suddenly around 65, 66, and especially getting into 67 and later, there's this extraordinary explosion of just incredible creativity and inventiveness in popular music. And I think part of the reason that happened was when you had this sort of cultural revolution in America in the late 1960s with psychedelia and hippies and all of that sort of thing. There was a time when the executives who were running the music industry genuinely had no idea what kids would find appealing and what they wouldn't. I mean, they had no idea, so they didn't know what to put out, what would be a good idea to release on an album, what would be a good idea to promote or not. And so what happened was they just started to say, well, I have no idea. So, they would put out releases that were actually quite unusual or quite avant-garde and just throw them out there and see if anyone was interested. So you had a brief period of time. I don't think it lasted all that long. By maybe the mid 70s, they started to sort of figure out what was working, what wasn't working, and it became a lot more streamlined at that point. But for maybe 5 to 10 years, you had this period where they would try anything. They would put out some strange album and just see if anybody was interested in it. And I think it's not a coincidence that was one of the most fruitful and interesting and varied and exciting times in terms of popular music. After the mid-1970s especially, it starts to get a lot more homogenous and a lot less interesting, I think. I'm speaking in general terms, of course. I mean, obviously there were great musical acts that came out of that period as well. But I think it depends on the period to some degree. There are periods where there's a certain attitude of let's just see what happens, and then we'll put out a bunch of different things and see what ends up being popular. And then there's periods where it's much more conservative and where they're saying, okay, we know what already works, so let's try to sort of focus more on that. And I think what's happening today is that the industry is rapidly transforming in a very unpredictable manner. And I think that's causing a great deal of chaos and a great deal of just, of artists not really knowing exactly what to do, because you no longer really have these all-powerful record labels that have a huge amount of influence and can decide who to make into stars and so on, because, well, you have the revolution of YouTube, which you're participating in, for example. I mean, YouTube is absolutely amazing because it democratizes conversation, it democratizes the press, it democratizes culture, and so on. And so now you have artists who are becoming famous through YouTube, which is, it's extremely recent. It's a very new phenomenon. It's just a few years old, I guess. And so it's no longer the case that only a major record label with serious means behind it can turn someone into a celebrity or, make their music become famous. So there's other ways to do that now. And that's a very positive thing, I think, because it also brings the control much more directly to the actual audience, and they can also choose to support the artist directly and so on and so forth. So that's good. What's maybe less good is that it's become a lot less simple for artists to make a living, just because when we did have that situation where there were certain record labels that were very influential and had a lot of resources and so on, it was a hierarchical structure, basically, where there would be a certain number of acts that would be at the top and that would have access to a lot of means and resources and could do very expensive tours and could actually make a living through their music. Whereas I think today there are obviously artists who make a good living at music, but it's not as simple as it was before. In other words, you now have to do everything yourself, and you have to know about marketing, you have to know about how to present yourself, you have to know about obviously contemporary technologies, you have to master social media and the internet and all of that sort of thing. So you can't just sort of sign on with a record label and have them sort of take care of everything. You really have to be a lot more creatively involved in everything yourself, and you have to be, it's a bit of a cliche to say this, but you have to be a bit of an entrepreneur. So on the one hand, there are a lot more possibilities, and on the other hand, it's probably a lot more difficult to navigate this new situation, because the range of skills that you have to have in order to do it successfully is a lot greater.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that what becomes successful in terms of music, and because the music industry experiments with different styles of music and so on to see what works with the audience they're targeting, that it's sort of a two-way street, that the music industry tries to promote certain types of music and certain artists, and that can work or not, but it also depends on the feedback coming from the audience. So it's not really that the music industry by itself creates people's tastes, right?
No, I don't think you can really say that the music industry exactly creates people's taste. I think there's a feedback. There's a sort of a two-way process in terms of them choosing to support certain things, and then some of them resonate with the public and some of them don't. So one of the interesting things about pop music and all of its associated subgenres is that it's actually extraordinarily difficult to know in advance what's going to be a success and what's not. And then after it has become a success, you really don't always know why. I mean, look at something like Gangnam Style, for example. I mean, it becomes the most watched video, I think, in YouTube history. Maybe something else has overtaken it by now, but I mean, why would that be? I mean, it's like you look at the song and it's fun, but is it the greatest piece of music ever written? I mean, so it's kind of a strange thing. Like, if you actually try to figure out the mechanism by which certain things become phenomenally popular, it's actually very complex. So it depends on a lot of different factors. So on the one hand, I suppose there's the song itself. Then there's the having influential people of some kind who are able to help get the message out. It has to resonate with the public. The timing has to be right. Also, it has to be the right time for that particular song. It has to be something that, for one reason or another, just resonates with people at that particular cultural moment. And those aren't things you can predict. So I think the best thing that an artist can do, really, is to be as authentic as they can possibly be. Write the music that is for them a form of truth, I suppose you would say, and do it as well as you can, and then just see if it connects with people. I find that it typically doesn't work very well if it's not sincere, or if it's overly calculated, or if people are just only trying to cater to existing tastes. I find that doesn't tend to go very far, and people can sort of, music listeners can tell rather quickly when that's happening, when it's not coming out of a genuine creative impulse, but it's just sort of copying things that have already been done.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just before we finish, could you please tell people where they maybe can follow your work, and tell them about the name of your channel is your name, actually, so and perhaps where they can find you on social media?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel is, just go onto YouTube and type Samuel, Samuel Andreyev, Andreyev, and you'll find my YouTube channel, where I have a lot of different types of videos. I do mainly, I mainly do sort of exposés or lectures on what I think are great works of 20th century music, 20th and 21st century music that I think everybody should know about. So even if you're just sort of curious, or you want to know more, you want to broaden your musical culture, I think I'm trying to reach all sorts of people, not just specialists. So that's my YouTube channel, Samuel Andreyev on YouTube, and then you can also follow me on Twitter at Samuel Andreyev. And what else? Well, I also have an Instagram account if anyone's interested in that.
Okay, so Mr. Andreyev, it was a real pleasure to have you on, and I hope you keep up with the good work, and I would really like to thank you for sparing a bit of your time to be here with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay, thank you again. Bye-bye.
No problem.
If you appreciate my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/thedissenter. Thank you.